Some houses are so quiet, you can hear the people they miss. The first thing I noticed about the Blackwood estate wasn't how big it was. It wasn't the iron gates that opened without a sound, or the long driveway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, or even the mansion itself standing at the top of the hill like something from an old movie. It was the silence. The kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. The kind that felt abandoned. Rain tapped softly against the windshield of my aging Honda as I parked near the service entrance. The dashboard clock read 6:47 a.m. I sat there for a moment with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of gas station coffee that had already gone cold. My stomach twisted with nerves. This was my third housekeeping job in 2 years. The first one disappeared when the family moved to Florida. The second ended when the hotel cut staff after renovations. I needed this one to work. Rent was due in 12 days. My mother's medical bills sat unopened in a drawer because looking at them didn't change the numbers. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the rain and hurried toward the side door. A woman named Margaret opened it before I could knock. She looked to be in her 60s, wearing a navy uniform and glasses hanging from a silver chain around her neck. "You must be Grace," she said. "Right on time." "I try to be." She nodded approvingly and stepped aside. Warm air wrapped around me as I entered. The scent of polished wood and fresh linen filled the hallway. Expensive. Clean. Perfect. Yet somehow empty. Margaret gave me a brief tour. The estate had 12 bedrooms, 14 bathrooms, 2 kitchens, an indoor pool, a private theater, and more square footage than my entire apartment building. But despite all that space, something felt wrong. Family photos were almost non-existent. No laughter echoed from distant rooms. No television played in the background. No signs of life. Just silence. "Most of the staff keep to themselves," Margaret explained. "And one important rule. Do not disturb Mr. Blackwood unless absolutely necessary." I nodded. Understood. She stopped walking and looked directly at me. "I mean it. He values privacy." The name meant nothing at first. Ethan Blackwood. I'd seen articles about billionaires before, but I didn't follow business news. To me, he was just another wealthy employer. Another person whose floors needed cleaning and whose sheets needed changing. The morning passed quickly. I dusted bookshelves taller than I was. Vacuumed hallways that seemed to stretch forever. Polished windows overlooking acres of green hills. Around noon, I carried fresh towels toward the west wing. That's when I noticed a door. Unlike every other door in the house, this one wasn't polished. It wasn't decorated. It was plain. Dark. Closed. And strangely out of place. Something about it made me stop. Maybe it was the faint layer of dust around the frame. Maybe it was the way every hallway seemed bright except this corner. Or maybe it was the feeling that someone had intentionally forgotten it existed. I stared for only a second before reminding myself that curiosity didn't pay bills. I turned away and continued down the hallway. Then I heard footsteps. Slow. Measured. Approaching from behind. Every instinct told me to move aside. I stepped toward the wall just as a tall man rounded the corner. He wore a charcoal suit without a wrinkle, his dark hair neatly combed back. He couldn't have been more than 40. Sharp features. Calm expression. Blue eyes that somehow felt colder than the rain outside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. His gaze moved from the towels in my arms to my face. Not rude. Not friendly. Just distant. Like someone looking through a window instead of at a person. Then he nodded once and continued walking. No greeting. No smile. No acknowledgement beyond that single glance. I watched him disappear around the corner before turning back to my work. "That was him," Margaret whispered later when she caught me standing near the laundry room. "Mr. Blackwood." I nodded slowly. But what stayed with me wasn't his expensive suit or the quiet authority he carried. It was his eyes. Because for just 1 second, behind all that wealth and control, I thought I saw something else. Loneliness. And I had the strange feeling that the locked door in the West Wing somehow knew exactly why. The next morning, the sky above the estate was the color of wet concrete, and a thin layer of fog hung over the rolling hills beyond the windows. I arrived 15 minutes early, partly because I needed the extra hours and partly because I could not stop thinking about Ethan Blackwood. Not in the way magazines talked about billionaires. Not because of his money or reputation. Because of that look in his eyes. The look of someone standing in a crowded room completely alone. The house felt exactly the same as it had the day before. Spotless. Silent. Empty. I spent most of the morning organizing a storage room off the main kitchen. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, lined with expensive cookware that looked untouched. Around 10 o'clock, Margaret appeared carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Blackwood has specific preferences," she said. "You should know them." I followed her into a small office where she handed me a neatly typed document. The list was surprisingly long. No fresh flowers in the West Wing. No music after 6 in the evening. No rearranging furniture. No guests without authorization. No personal conversations unless initiated by him. No entering certain areas of the house. I read through the pages twice. "These are all his rules?" I asked. Margaret nodded. "He likes things exactly the way they are." I looked around the enormous estate. "Has it always been this quiet?" Her expression softened for a moment. "Not always." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and left. The answer lingered in my mind for the rest of the day. Around lunchtime, I carried fresh linens upstairs. As I passed through the second-floor hallway, I heard voices drifting from an office with partially open doors. One voice belonged to Ethan. Calm. Controlled. The other sounded frustrated. "You cannot keep canceling meetings," the man said. "The board is asking questions." "Then answer them," Ethan replied. "You are the chief executive officer." "I am aware of my title." Silence followed. Then Ethan spoke again. "Reschedule everything for next month." "You said that last month." Another pause. "Do it anyway." I moved quietly down the hallway before they noticed me listening. Later, while cleaning the library, I found myself studying the room. Hundreds of books lined dark walnut shelves. Awards sat inside glass cases. Framed magazine covers showed Ethan smiling beside business partners, politicians, and celebrities. Yet every photograph looked old. Years old. It was as if time had stopped moving inside this house. Near sunset, I was dusting a table in the grand foyer when the front doors opened. Ethan stepped inside, removing his coat as rainwater dripped from the shoulders. One of the staff approached immediately with documents for him to sign. He accepted them without looking up. Then something unexpected happened. A delivery driver entered carrying a small package. "Special delivery for Mr. Blackwood," he said cheerfully. Ethan glanced at the box. For the first time, his composure shifted. "Not much. Just enough for me to notice." His jaw tightened. The color drained slightly from his face. "Take it away," he said quietly. "Sir?" I said take it away. The driver quickly apologized and left. Ethan stood motionless for several seconds before walking toward the staircase. As he passed, his gaze briefly landed on me. There was no anger there. No arrogance. Only exhaustion. The kind that sleep could never fix. Then he disappeared upstairs. An hour later, while finishing my shift, I passed the West Wing again. The locked door stood exactly where I remembered. Silent. Forgotten. But this time, something was different. Resting on the floor outside the door was a small silver picture frame. And inside it was the photograph of a smiling woman I had never seen before. The photograph stayed in my mind all night. Not because the woman looked extraordinary. She looked normal. Warm smile. Bright eyes. Windblown blonde hair caught in the sunlight. The kind of face you passed in a grocery store and instantly trusted. Yet somehow her picture sitting outside that locked door felt important. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the estate's massive windows for the first time since I had started working there. Golden light stretched across marble floors and illuminated corners that usually felt hidden. For a few hours, the mansion almost looked alive. I was dusting shelves in the main living room when Margaret appeared carrying fresh linens. "You seem distracted," she said. I hesitated. The picture outside the West Wing. Her expression changed immediately. Not alarm. More like caution. "Do not ask questions about things that are not your business, Grace." I was only curious. Curiosity can make a difficult job harder. Then she walked away. That should have been enough. It should have ended there. But the house itself seemed full of unanswered questions. Everywhere I looked, I found traces of someone who was no longer there. A favorite chair positioned near a fireplace. A collection of gardening books in perfect condition. A ceramic coffee mug tucked behind expensive crystal glasses. Small details that did not belong to a billionaire living alone. Around noon, I carried fresh towels upstairs and noticed Ethan standing near a window overlooking the gardens. He did not see me at first. His hands rested in his pockets. His gaze fixed on something outside. Following his line of sight, I noticed an empty stone bench beneath an old oak tree. Nothing remarkable about it. Yet he stared at it with such focus that it felt significant. For a moment, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man trapped inside a memory. Then he turned. Our eyes met. "Good afternoon, Mr. Blackwood," I said quietly. He nodded once. "Good afternoon." The words surprised me. It was the first time he had spoken directly to me. His voice was deeper than I expected. Calm. Polite. Controlled. Before I could say anything else, he continued down the hallway and disappeared. The interaction lasted less than 5 seconds, but somehow it stayed with me all day. That evening, most of the staff had already left when I realized I had forgotten my phone in the laundry room. The house felt even larger after dark. Shadows stretched across the walls. The silence seemed heavier. As I walked through the second floor, I noticed something unusual. Light spilled from beneath the locked door in the West Wing. I stopped. Every other room along the hallway was dark. Only that door glowed softly against the polished floor. My pulse quickened. Someone was inside. Before I could stop myself, I took a few careful steps closer. The light flickered slightly. Then I heard music. Faint. Almost impossible to catch. A piano melody drifting through the silence. Slow. Beautiful. Sad. I stood frozen, listening. It lasted less than a minute before suddenly stopping. Silence rushed back into the hallway. Then came the sound of footsteps approaching from the other side of the door. I stepped back immediately. The handle moved. My breath caught. And for the first time since arriving at the estate, the mysterious door began to open. The handle turned slowly, and my heart began pounding so hard I was certain whoever stood behind the door would hear it. I took another step backward as the door opened just a few inches. Warm light spilled into the hallway. For a moment, nobody appeared. Then Ethan stepped out. He stopped immediately when he saw me standing there. Neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavier than usual. His expression revealed nothing, but there was something different about him. The cold distance I had grown used to was gone. In its place was something more fragile. Something tired. Grace. My name sounded strange in his voice. "I am sorry," I said quickly. I was walking past and saw the light. His gaze shifted briefly toward the partially open door before returning to me. "You should head home. It is late." I nodded. Yes, sir. For a second, I thought the conversation was over. Then he surprised me. You have been working here for almost 2 weeks. That is right. How do you like it so far? The question caught me off guard. It is beautiful. His eyes moved down the hallway. Beautiful is one word for it. Before I could respond, he gently closed the door behind him. Good night, Grace. Good night, Mr. Blackwood. I left the estate with more questions than answers. The next morning, sunshine filled the grounds. The garden sparkled beneath the early light, and for the first time I noticed how neglected parts of them had become. Several flower beds sat empty. Weeds pushed through cracks in the stone paths. Bushes had grown uneven and wild. It seemed strange considering how perfectly maintained everything else was. Around noon, I found Margaret reviewing inventory sheets in the kitchen. Did there used to be a gardener? I asked. She looked up. There used to be several. What happened? Margaret sighed quietly. After Mrs. Blackwood passed away, many things changed. My stomach tightened. Mrs. Blackwood. Suddenly the photograph made sense. The gardening books. The empty bench beneath the oak tree. The locked room. She loved those gardens, Margaret continued softly. Spent hours out there every week. What was she like? Margaret smiled sadly. The kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday. The kind of person who brought life into every room she entered. Before I could ask more, she returned to her paperwork. But her words stayed with me. That afternoon, while cleaning a sitting room overlooking the south lawn, I noticed several clay flower pots stacked near a window. Dust covered them. Most appeared unused for years. Without really thinking about it, I carried one outside. Then another. Then another. During my lunch break, I drove to a local nursery and spent $20 I probably should not have spent on flowers. Nothing extravagant. Just bright yellow daisies and white petunias. The kind of flowers that made people smile. I planted them beside the stone path leading toward the oak tree. The work took less than an hour. When I finished, the small patch of color transformed the space completely. It felt warmer. Friendlier. Alive. I stood back, brushing dirt from my hands, feeling oddly proud. Then I heard a voice behind me. Who did this? Every muscle in my body froze. I turned slowly and found Ethan standing several feet away. His eyes were fixed on the flowers. The expression on his face was impossible to read. And for the first time since meeting him, I realized I might have made a very serious mistake. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The afternoon breeze carried the faint scent of fresh soil and flowers through the garden, but Ethan remained completely still. His eyes stayed fixed on the daisies and petunias as if they had appeared from another world. My stomach sank. I am sorry, I said quickly. I should have asked first. He did not answer. The silence stretched so long that I began preparing myself for a reprimand. After all, I had ignored one of the unwritten rules of the estate. Do not change anything. Do not disturb the carefully preserved stillness. Why? He finally asked. His voice was quiet. Why what? Why did you plant them? I looked at the small patch of color beside the stone path. Because the space looked lonely. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Lonely. Of all the things I could have said. Ethan lowered his gaze. For a second, I thought I saw something flicker across his expression. Not anger. Something deeper. Something painful. You should not spend your own money on this place, he said. It was only $20. That is $20 you could have kept. I offered a small smile. Maybe. But they look nice. His eyes returned to the flowers. The breeze gently moved the yellow petals. For the first time since I had met him, his shoulders seemed to relax slightly. Just a little. Barely noticeable. Yet enough for me to see it. Then he surprised me again. She liked daisies. I blinked. Mrs. Blackwood? He nodded once. They were her favorite. The words sounded strange coming from him. Fragile. Like something he had not spoken aloud in a very long time. Neither of us said anything after that. Eventually he turned and walked back toward the house. No criticism. No order to remove the flowers. Just silence. Later that evening, I found Margaret in the kitchen preparing inventory reports. I think I made a mistake, I admitted. She adjusted her glasses. What happened? When I explained about the flowers, her eyes widened. And he did not ask you to remove them? No, interesting. Interesting? Margaret studied me carefully. Those flower beds have been empty for 5 years. I stared at her. 5 years? She nodded. Nobody has touched them since Mrs. Blackwood passed away. That information stayed with me the entire drive home. 5 years. 5 years of empty flower beds. 5 years of locked rooms. 5 years of silence. The next morning, I arrived at the estate expecting everything to return to normal. Instead, something felt different the moment I stepped inside. The house was still quiet, but the atmosphere seemed lighter somehow. Less suffocating. As I passed through the foyer, I noticed fresh sunlight streaming through windows that were usually covered by heavy curtains. Someone had opened them. Around noon, I carried a stack of folded linens toward the second floor when I glanced outside and froze. Ethan was standing beside the flower bed. He was alone beneath the oak tree. One hand rested in his pocket while the other gently touched a yellow daisy. He looked down at the flowers for a long moment. Then something happened that made me stop breathing. For the first time since I had arrived at the estate, Ethan Blackwood smiled. Some smiles change nothing. Others make you question everything you thought you knew about a person. I stood frozen beside the second-floor window long after Ethan walked away from the flower bed. The image refused to leave my mind. That brief smile had lasted only a second, maybe 2. Yet it felt more significant than all the expensive artwork hanging inside the mansion. For the first time, the house no longer felt completely asleep. Over the next few days, little things began changing. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone else might notice. But I noticed. The curtains remained open longer each morning. The dining room, which usually sat untouched, showed signs of use. A coffee cup appeared beside the garden-facing window on several occasions. Once, I even heard music drifting softly from somewhere upstairs during my lunch break. Not the sad piano melody from the locked room. Something lighter. Almost hopeful. Then I started noticing something else. Ethan was watching. Not in a strange way. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable. More like a person observing a puzzle he could not quite solve. One afternoon, I was trimming dead leaves from the flower bed when I saw him standing on a balcony overlooking the garden. He appeared to be reading documents, but every few minutes his gaze drifted toward the flowers. Toward me. The moment I looked up, he returned his attention to the papers. The next day, I brought homemade blueberry muffins for the staff. My mother had taught me the recipe years ago, back when she still had enough energy to spend entire afternoons in the kitchen. I left a plate in the break room and thought nothing of it. An hour later, Margaret walked in with an amused expression. "What?" I asked. Mr. Blackwood took one. I nearly dropped the stack of towels in my hands. "One what?" "A muffin." I stared at her. "You are joking." "I have worked here 8 years," she said. "That man usually ignores everything that appears in the staff kitchen." Today he asked who made them. My face warmed slightly. And he took another one. For the rest of the afternoon, I found myself smiling for no reason. It was ridiculous. We had exchanged fewer than 20 conversations since I arrived. Yet every small change felt like watching sunlight slowly return after a very long winter. A few days later, my shift ended earlier than usual. On my drive home, I stopped at a small grocery store near my apartment. While comparing prices on soup cans, I noticed an elderly woman struggling to reach an item on the top shelf. Without thinking, I stepped over and grabbed it for her. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said with a grateful smile. "Of course." A few minutes later, I helped another customer carry a heavy bag to her car. It was nothing special. Just normal things. The kind of things my mother always taught me to do. The next morning, I nearly spilled my coffee when Margaret approached me. "Did you stop at Harrison's Market yesterday?" she asked. "Yes." "Interesting. Why?" She tried and failed to hide a smile. "Because Mr. Blackwood owns it." My stomach dropped. "What?" "And according to the manager, he reviewed security footage last night for a completely unrelated business matter." She paused. "That is apparently how he learned that half the town already knows you by name." Before I could respond, a black luxury SUV rolled slowly into the driveway. Ethan stepped out and glanced toward the front entrance. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the distance. Then he gave me a small nod. Not the cold, formal acknowledgement from before. Something warmer. Something personal. And for the first time, I had the strange feeling that Ethan Blackwood was beginning to look forward to seeing me. The hardest truths are usually hidden in the quietest places. A week after the flowers appeared, the estate continued changing in ways that were almost impossible to measure. Staff members smiled more. The kitchen felt warmer. Even the hallways seemed less cold. Yet the biggest change remained Ethan himself. He still worked long hours. He still carried the weight of responsibilities most people could not imagine. But every now and then, I would catch glimpses of the man underneath the billionaire. One rainy afternoon, thunder rolled across the hills while I organized books in the library. The weather had driven everyone indoors. Large drops of rain tapped against the windows, turning the outside world into a watercolor painting of gray skies and blurred trees. I was placing a novel back onto a shelf when I noticed Ethan sitting alone near the fireplace. An untouched cup of coffee rested beside him. A thick folder lay open on his lap. Yet he was not reading. He was staring into the flames. Lost somewhere far away. I should have left him alone. Instead, I quietly approached. "Would you like fresh coffee?" I asked. He looked up slowly. "This one is fine." His voice was polite, but distant. Then his gaze shifted toward the rain outside. "She loved storms." The words came unexpectedly. Almost as if he had forgotten I was there. I sat a respectful distance away. "Mrs. Blackwood?" He nodded. For several seconds, only the sound of rain filled the room. Then, for the first time, Ethan began talking about her. Her name was Emily. A faint smile touched his face. She would open every curtain in the house during a storm. Said the sky looked alive. I listened quietly. She planted flowers everywhere. Even places they were not supposed to grow. His eyes drifted toward the fire. "I used to complain about the mess." The smile faded. Now I would give anything to see it again. Something tightened in my chest. Not because of what he said. Because of how he said it. Every word sounded carefully protected. Like fragile glass carried for years. Margaret said she brought life into every room. Ethan lowered his gaze. "That sounds like something Margaret would say." Another silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. Then he surprised me once again. "Do you know why the West Wing stayed closed?" I shook my head. It was her music room. My breath caught. The piano. The light beneath the door. Everything suddenly made sense. After she passed away, I locked it. His voice grew quieter. "I thought if nobody entered, nothing would change." Rain continued sliding down the windows. Did it help? I asked gently. Ethan gave a sad smile. No, the answer came immediately. No hesitation. No defenses. Just truth. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stood and walked toward one of the bookshelves. Reaching behind a row of novels, he removed a framed photograph. It was the same woman I had seen outside the locked door. Emily. Smiling beneath summer sunlight. Holding a basket of yellow daisies. Ethan studied the photograph before looking back at me. You know, he said softly, those flowers you planted were the first new thing I allowed into this house in 5 years. Then he glanced toward the second floor. Toward the west wing. And for the first time since he began speaking, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Maybe it is finally time to open that door. Secrets have a way of revealing themselves when you stop trying to hide from the truth. 2 days after our conversation in the library, the atmosphere inside the estate felt different again. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough to notice. The locked door in the west wing remained closed, but something had shifted. It no longer felt forbidden. It felt like a decision waiting to be made. Meanwhile, I found myself growing more comfortable around Ethan. We still spoke only occasionally, but the awkward distance between us had begun to fade. One afternoon, I was arranging fresh towels in a guest suite when my phone vibrated inside my pocket. The screen displayed the name I always answered immediately. Mom. I stepped into the hallway and accepted the call. Her voice sounded cheerful at first, but I could hear the exhaustion underneath. The kind she always tried to hide from me. Sweetheart, are you working? Just finishing a room. I did not want to bother you. Which usually meant something was wrong. I leaned against the wall. What happened? A pause followed. The pharmacy called again. My eyes closed. I already knew what came next. The insurance company had changed coverage. One of her medications now cost almost $300 more each month. $300 might not mean much to some people. To me, it felt enormous. I calculated expenses automatically. Rent. Utilities. Gas. Groceries. Medical appointments. There was never enough left over. I will figure it out, I said. Grace. Her voice softened. You cannot keep carrying everything by yourself. I forced a smile she could not see. Watch me. After we ended the call, I stood there staring at the floor for several seconds. Then I slipped the phone back into my pocket and returned to work. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. By evening, I thought nobody had noticed anything. I was wrong. The following morning, Ethan stopped me near the staircase. Are you all right? The question caught me off guard. Of course. His blue eyes studied me carefully. You seem distracted. Just family stuff. I immediately regretted saying it. Personal conversations were not part of this job. Yet Ethan did not press. He simply nodded. Family matters usually weigh the most. Then he continued walking. The exchange lasted less than a minute. Still, something about it stayed with me. That night, after my shift ended, I drove straight to my mother's apartment. The building was old. The paint peeled from several walls. The elevator worked only when it felt like cooperating. But it was home. Mom greeted me with her usual smile. The same smile she used whenever she wanted to pretend everything was fine. We spent the evening sharing takeout soup and watching old movies. Before leaving, I quietly slipped an envelope containing most of my savings into her kitchen drawer. She would find it later. She would argue about it tomorrow. I drove home knowing I had exactly $87 left in my checking account. The next morning, I arrived at the estate earlier than usual. As I entered through the service entrance, Margaret appeared holding a sealed envelope. This came for you. Confused, I accepted it. There was no return address. No note. Only my name written neatly across the front. My stomach tightened as I opened it. Inside was a gift card from the pharmacy that handled my mother's prescriptions. The balance covered 6 months of medication. My breath caught. There was no explanation. No signature. Nothing except a small handwritten message on a blank card. Some burdens become lighter when they are shared. I stared at the words for a long time. Then I slowly looked toward the second-floor balcony overlooking the foyer. Ethan stood there watching the sunrise through the massive windows. And somehow, without either of us saying a single word, I knew exactly who had sent it. Kindness becomes complicated the moment it costs someone something. I carried the envelope in my bag for 2 days before finally deciding what to do. Every time I looked at it, I felt the same mixture of gratitude and discomfort. The help meant more than Ethan could possibly know. 6 months of medication would remove a weight that had been sitting on my shoulders for years. But accepting it felt wrong. Not because I was ungrateful. Because I had spent my entire life trying to stand on my own feet. The following afternoon, clouds gathered over the estate once again. The air smelled like rain. I found Ethan in his office reviewing paperwork near a wall of windows overlooking the hills. He glanced up when I knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Grace." I stepped inside holding the envelope. "I think this belongs to you." His eyes dropped to it immediately. Neither of us pretended. "I do not know what you mean." I almost laughed. "You are a terrible liar." To my surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I have been told that before." I placed the envelope on his desk. "I cannot accept it." The small smile disappeared. "Why?" "Because it is too much." He leaned back in his chair. "Is it?" "Yes." "Would you have accepted it from a family member?" The question caught me off guard. "That is different." "Why?" I searched for an answer but could not find one. Ethan looked toward the window for a moment before speaking again. "Grace, there was a time when I believed solving problems was simple. Money could fix anything. Then life taught me otherwise." His voice remained calm. "I know this does not fix everything. I know that." He looked back at me. "But it helps." Silence settled between us. The rain finally began outside, soft drops tapping against the glass. "I appreciate what you were trying to do," I said quietly. "More than you know." "Then let me." My heart tightened. Not because of the gift. Because of the sincerity behind it. There was no arrogance in his voice. No expectation. No desire to impress. Just genuine concern. For a moment, I understood how lonely he must have been. A man surrounded by resources yet unable to use them for the one person he desperately wanted to save. I gently pushed the envelope back across the desk. If I accept help, I want it to be because someone believes in me. Not because they feel sorry for me. Ethan stared at the envelope for several seconds. Then he nodded slowly. "Fair enough." The conversation ended there. Or at least I thought it had. That evening, after finishing my shift, I walked through the foyer toward the front entrance. Margaret intercepted me before I reached the door. "You should see this." Confused, I followed her outside. The sight waiting near the garden stopped me cold. Several workers were carefully restoring the neglected flower beds surrounding the estate. Fresh soil. New plants. New pathways. The entire garden was coming back to life. "What happened?" I asked. Margaret smiled. "Mr. Blackwood approved the renovation this morning." My gaze drifted toward the second-floor balcony. Ethan stood there watching the workers below. The moment our eyes met, he gave a small nod. Not victory. Not persuasion. Respect. Then I realized something important. He had listened. He had accepted my answer. Yet somehow, he had still found a way to keep moving forward. And for the first time in years, the estate no longer looked like a place trapped in the past. It looked like a place preparing for the future. Sometimes a heart breaks quietly. No dramatic moment. No warning. Just a phone call that changes everything. 3 weeks after the garden renovation began, the estate looked completely different. Fresh flowers lined the pathways. New roses climbed the stone walls. The old oak tree no longer stood alone in a sea of neglected grass. Everywhere I looked, life seemed to be returning. Even Ethan looked different. He spent more time outside. He occasionally joined Margaret and me for coffee in the kitchen. Once, I even caught him laughing at one of the groundskeeper's terrible jokes. The sound startled all of us. It felt like hearing someone speak a forgotten language. Then everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon. I was folding linens in the laundry room when my phone rang. The moment I saw the hospital's number, my stomach tightened. Nurses rarely called family members in the middle of the day with good news. I answered immediately. The woman on the other end sounded kind. Professional. Careful. My mother had collapsed during a routine appointment. They wanted me to come as soon as possible. I do not remember hanging up. I do not remember grabbing my keys. One moment I was standing in the estate. The next I was halfway across town with tears blurring the road ahead. By the time I reached the hospital, doctors had stabilized her condition. She was awake. Smiling even. Trying to reassure me like always. But I could see the truth in the exhausted faces surrounding her room. Her health was getting worse. Much worse. That evening I sat beside her bed holding her hand while monitors hummed softly nearby. The room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. Outside the window, darkness settled over the city. "You should not look so scared," Mom whispered. "I am not scared." She raised an eyebrow. "Grace." I laughed despite myself. "Okay. Maybe a little." Her smile softened. "You spend so much time taking care of everyone else." She squeezed my hand. "Who takes care of you?" I could not answer. Because I did not know. I stayed at the hospital until nearly midnight before finally driving home. The next morning, exhaustion followed me like a shadow. I arrived at the estate running purely on coffee and determination. My head ached. My thoughts felt tangled. I made mistakes. Small ones. Folding towels incorrectly. Misplacing inventory sheets. Forgetting appointments. Around noon, I nearly dropped a tray while carrying dishes through the dining room. Ethan caught it before it slipped from my hands. "Grace." His voice immediately sharpened with concern. "What happened?" I tried to smile. "Nothing." He did not believe me. That was not nothing. The concern in his eyes almost broke me. I looked away. "My mother is sick." The words came out smaller than I intended. Silence followed. When I finally looked back, Ethan's expression had changed completely. Not pity. Not sympathy. Recognition. As though he understood something I wished he did not. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly set the tray on the table. His hands trembled slightly. The sight shocked me. Ethan Blackwood never seemed uncertain. Never seemed vulnerable. Yet now he stared at the floor as though fighting a battle nobody else could see. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The hardest part is knowing you would give anything to help them." His eyes glistened beneath the afternoon light. "And realizing some things cannot be bought." In that moment, I understood. He was not talking about my mother. He was talking about Emily. And for the first time since I had known him, I saw the full weight of the grief he had been carrying alone. Some conversations change your future long before you realize it. After that afternoon in the dining room, something shifted between Ethan and me. Not because he had revealed his grief. I had seen pieces of it before. It was because, for the first time, he stopped pretending he was untouched by it. The following days passed quietly. My mother's condition remained stable, which felt like a blessing. I spent my mornings at the estate and most evenings at the hospital. Sleep became a luxury. Coffee became a necessity. Yet somehow, I kept going. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and amber, I finished organizing the last guest room and headed downstairs. The estate was unusually quiet. Margaret had already gone home. Most of the staff had left. The scent of fresh flowers drifted through open windows. As I crossed the foyer, I noticed light coming from the west wing. My footsteps slowed. The door was open. Not partially. Completely. For a moment, I simply stood there. The room that had remained closed for 5 years was finally visible. Soft evening light spilled across polished hardwood floors. A grand piano sat near the far window. Shelves held sheet music and photographs. Fresh air moved gently through open curtains. The room no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a memory learning how to breathe again. I thought you might be curious. Ethan's voice came from behind me. I turned to find him standing quietly in the hallway. You opened it. He nodded. A few days ago. I stepped inside carefully. Every detail seemed personal. Real. Human. Unlike the rest of the estate. A framed photograph sat on top of the piano. Emily was laughing in the picture, her arms full of yellow daisies. I smiled. She looks happy. Ethan walked over slowly. She was. Silence settled around us. Not uncomfortable. Familiar. Then he surprised me again. Do you know something strange? I looked at him. What? His gaze moved across the room. For years I thought preserving everything would keep her close. His voice softened. But all it did was keep me trapped. The fading sunlight reflected in his eyes. Then you showed up. My heart skipped unexpectedly. Ethan gave a small laugh. You planted flowers where nobody asked for flowers. You talked to staff members whose names I had forgotten. You made blueberry muffins that somehow became the most discussed event in this house. I laughed despite myself. That is quite an accomplishment. You reminded me that life keeps moving whether we participate or not. The room grew quiet again. Outside, the wind moved through the gardens below. Ethan looked directly at me. There was no distance in his expression anymore. No walls. No carefully controlled mask. Just honesty. Grace, before you came here, I spent 5 years surviving. His voice became barely above a whisper. You are the reason I started living again. Emotion tightened in my chest so suddenly that I could not speak. Ethan looked away briefly, as though gathering courage. Then he turned back. I do not know what happens next. A faint smile touched his face. I only know that every good thing that has happened in this house started the day you walked through that door. And standing there in the room he had once locked away from the world, I realized neither of our lives would ever be the same again. Life rarely asks whether you are ready before it forces you to choose. A week after our conversation in the music room, I received a phone call that should have made me happy. Instead, it left me sitting in my car outside the estate with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The offer came from a healthcare foundation in Seattle. Months earlier, before I ever met Ethan, I had submitted an application for a patient advocacy position. Better salary. Better benefits. More stability. At the time, it had felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. Now it felt like a complication I had never anticipated. The position came with one condition. I would need to relocate within 30 days. I spent the entire morning trying to focus on work, but my thoughts kept returning to the same question. What was I supposed to do? The practical answer seemed obvious. My mother's medical expenses continued growing. The new salary would change everything. It would provide security I had never known. Yet every time I imagined leaving, something inside me resisted. By late afternoon, the weight of the decision felt impossible to ignore. I found myself standing beside the flower garden beneath the old oak tree when Ethan appeared. He immediately noticed something was wrong. "Grace." His voice carried quiet concern. "What happened?" I stared at the flowers for several seconds before answering. "I received a job offer." For a brief moment, I saw genuine happiness cross his face. "That is wonderful news." I nodded slowly. "It is in Seattle." The happiness disappeared. Neither of us spoke. The breeze moved softly through the garden. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called from the trees. Everything felt strangely quiet. "When would you leave?" he finally asked. "A few weeks." The words hurt more than I expected. Ethan looked away toward the hills beyond the estate. His expression remained calm, but I could feel the shift in him. The disappointment. The realization. "You should take it," he said. I blinked. "What?" "You worked hard for opportunities like this." His voice remained steady. "You deserve them." I wanted him to argue. I wanted him to tell me to stay. Instead, he was doing what he always did when it mattered most. Putting someone else's future ahead of his own feelings. That somehow made everything harder. "It is not that simple." Ethan gave a sad smile. "The important choices never are." For the next several days, neither of us mentioned Seattle again. Yet the knowledge sat between us constantly. Every conversation felt more meaningful. Every shared cup of coffee lasted a little longer. Every smile carried something unspoken beneath it. Then came my final Friday before the deadline. The estate glowed beneath the golden light of sunset. The gardens were alive with color. Staff members moved through the halls with easy laughter. Everything we had slowly rebuilt together seemed brighter than ever. Standing near the front entrance, I looked around and realized something that frightened me. This place no longer felt like a job. It felt like home. And as I turned toward the driveway, I saw Ethan watching me from the top of the staircase. His eyes met mine across the distance. Neither of us said a word. But in that silent moment, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Leaving would be far more painful than staying. The morning of my decision arrived beneath a sky so clear it almost looked painted. Sunlight spilled across the estate, turning every window into gold. The gardens bloomed with color. The oak tree stood tall above the pathways. Everything felt alive. Yet my chest felt heavier with every mile as I drove toward the airport. My suitcase rested in the trunk. The job offer sat folded inside my bag. Seattle waited on the other side of a boarding pass. I should have felt excited. Instead, I felt like I was leaving something unfinished behind. The previous evening had been quiet. Ethan and I had spoken only briefly. Neither of us mentioned the future. Neither of us mentioned goodbye. Somehow that made it hurt more. By the time I entered the terminal, passengers hurried around me carrying coffee cups and rolling suitcases. Flight announcements echoed through the building. Life moved forward exactly as it always did. I checked my watch. 30 minutes until boarding. My phone remained silent. Part of me hated myself for noticing. Another part could not stop looking. I found an empty seat near a large window overlooking the runway and stared at the planes. This was the practical choice. The responsible choice. The choice I had worked toward for years. Then my phone rang. "Margaret." Confused, I answered immediately. "Grace." Her voice sounded breathless. "Where are you?" "The airport." A pause followed. "You should look outside." Before I could ask what she meant, the call ended. Frowning, I stood and moved closer to the glass. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then I noticed a familiar black vehicle pulling to a stop near the terminal entrance. My heart nearly stopped. The driver's door opened. Ethan stepped out. For a second, neither of us moved. We simply stared through the glass and distance separating us. Then he started walking. Minutes later, he entered the terminal. His suit jacket was missing. His hair was slightly disheveled. He looked nothing like the perfectly controlled billionaire who once hid behind silence. He looked like a man who had run out of time. "You came." The words barely escaped me. Ethan smiled softly. "I almost did not." I laughed through unexpected tears. "That would have been unfortunate." He stopped in front of me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the airport seemed to disappear. There was only us. "You were right," Ethan finally said. "About a lot of things." I shook my head. "I doubt that." No, his eyes held mine. "You taught me that grief is not love. Holding on is not living. And surviving is not the same as having a life." Emotion tightened my throat. Ethan reached into his pocket and removed a small object. A silver key. "What is that?" I asked. "The music room." He placed it gently in my hand. "The last door I was afraid to open." My vision blurred. "Ethan." He took a breath. "I do not want you to stay because I need you." His voice remained steady. "I want you to stay because I love who I am when you are here." The words settled between us with quiet certainty. No grand speech. No dramatic gesture. Just truth. The kind that changes everything. A boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Neither of us looked away. Then, slowly, I smiled. "Good." Ethan's expression filled with hope. "Good?" I nodded. "Because I already turned down Seattle yesterday." For one stunned second, he simply stared at me. Then he laughed. The sound was warm and genuine and completely alive. Months later, the estate looked nothing like the place I first entered. The gardens flourished. Music filled the West Wing again. My mother spent afternoons beneath the oak tree drinking tea with Margaret. And every morning, sunlight poured through open curtains across a home that no longer felt haunted by loss. It felt filled with second chances. Sometimes people think love changes your life all at once. In my experience, it happens differently. It arrives quietly. It plants a flower where there was once emptiness. Then one day you look around and realize an entire garden has grown.